And a very warm welcome to the LBC Book Club. It's that time of the week again when I talk to a best-selling author. And tonight I'm going to be talking to Michael Dobbs. And you don't get much better selling than Michael Dobbs. He was the man who created Francis Urquhart. Remember the Chief Whip in House of Cards, the House of Cards trilogy? You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment. I've always wanted to invent... Well, it's not really a catchphrase, is it? But I've always wanted to invent something like that. Never have done. Probably never will. But Michael Dobbs is with me now. Good evening, Michael.
Ian, lovely to be here.
Well, thank you for coming in. And you've written a new book, a new novel, Old Enemies, it's called. Is it out today? It's out this week, I think.
It's out this week, later this week.
$12.99 in paperback. Although I've got the hardback version. Is that hardback out now?
No,
simultaneously?
It's hardback and trade paperback, so that's right. How many
So they do that together?
Do
how bizarre. Why would
no,
you...
No, because the hardback market is falling away, being taken over by the trade paperback. And what we say about the trade paperback, that's the size of the hardback, and exactly the same illustration and wordage and everything else. But instead of hardback, it's got paperback, and you save about £5 or £6 on the price.
Well, I won't have paperbacks on my shelves at home, I have to tell you. So anyway, I've got the hardback here, which is $19.99. The paperback is $12.99 if you're being a skinflint, and no doubt on many websites it's a lot cheaper than that. Well, we'll talk about the book in a moment, but I want to congratulate you first of all, because as of the 18th of December, you are now Lord Dobbs.
Yes.
What on earth have you done to deserve that?
I really don't know. You know, I go into the place and somebody says, "Good morning, my lord," and I keep looking over my shoulders. Who are they talking about? Yes, it is rather weird having another job. I've never had a proper job, and I still don't regard this as being a proper job. But it's a fascinating place to do it.
Well, because your background is in politics, isn't it? I mean, you worked for Margaret Thatcher, you worked for Norman Tebbit back in the 1980s, and I guess that's where you made your name in politics before you started writing. Just tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, it seems that all of my career changes, and of course I must have had about 6 or 7 different careers now, have all happened over alcohol, I'm glad to say.
Sorry we haven't got any to supply you with tonight.
Oh, I think a cup of tea's on its way, that'll do.
Right.
And I fell into a job interview without realising it, and it turned out that was a job for the Conservative Party. And I got rather fascinated by it. I was sitting in an office in Westminster, and young men were dashing backwards and forwards, seeming to be enjoying what they were doing. And they offered me a job, and I said, "Oh, that's wonderful. How much do you pay?" and the chap looked at me and said, "You need a salary?" Because in those days, you expected to work for nothing. So I fell in by chance into a job with the Conservative Party. I ended up being with Maggie Thatcher all through the... up until the election campaign in 1979. I actually was the first person to tell her she had become Prime Minister on that election night, because I was sitting with her at her count in Finchley at Barnet Town Hall, and the results were coming in. It was quite clear that she was going to win. I said, "Congratulations, you're Prime Minister." And she said, "We shall see, we shall see." And we did.
She was never one to count her electoral chickens, was she?
She wasn't. But like most people, I ended up falling out with her. Politics is like that, isn't it, sadly? How? Well, actually, she came up with the ludicrous idea that I was plotting against her. When I was Chief of Staff of the Conservative Party, and she'd been in power then a very long time, in fact, too long, she came to the conclusion that I was plotting to replace her. Absolute nonsense, but she believed it, and she made sure that life was very difficult for me. But that's what happens in politics. Politics is about taking tough decisions. It's not about taking the easy decisions, and you've got to expect a lot of rough riding along the way.
But I suppose some of that experience gave you some great ideas for some novel plots.
Oh, goodness me. Well, actually, I owe it to her for starting the whole thing, because there was a time just a week before an election in 1987 where Willie Whitelaw turned round to me, we'd both just been through the most awful meeting with her. And having said all this, I'm still a huge fan. I think for 6 years she was brilliant, and she helped turn this country around. So I'm not here sort of saying she's a dreadful old harridan. She wasn't, but she had a difficult side, and I received part of that. And Willie Whitelaw often came across as being
every Prime Minister needed a Willie, as Margaret Thatcher famously once said.
And proving that she had absolutely no sense of humour and often didn't understand what she was saying. But she'd given us a terrible tough time, and Willie turned around to me and said, "There's a woman who will never fight another election campaign." And I thought he was barking mad, because she was a week away from winning her third election. But I suddenly realised, when I was on holiday just a couple of weeks later, that he was right, because he had seen her beginning to sow the seeds of her own destruction, which we all saw publicly just 2 or 3 years later. So that's what inspired House of Cards, which is the first book, which was a plot about getting rid of a sitting Prime Minister, which, lo and behold, is what happened. So I owe her a lot.
And let's talk a little bit about House of Cards, because that was really what made your name, I guess. It was your first book, wasn't it?
It was indeed.
How did you come up with the character of Francis Urquhart? And who was it based on?
It is after 9 o'clock, so I can actually tell you. The character was based, and the name was based on the initials. I wanted his initials to sum up the character and his name. So once you come up with FU, you've got to go to something like Francis Urquhart, and it all worked wonderfully well. And he was a man who would do anything to anybody in order to get his way. Really instructive, because I'd seen whips do some fascinating things, and in fact I'm still seeing them do fascinating things, because I'm in trouble.
Well, you are
with
now being
whips,
whipped, yes, because you rebelled last week.
Oh, I did, didn't I? Woe is me, alas alack. And so they're wonderful people, whips, and I just wanted to use a whip as the main character.
For the uninitiated, just explain what a whip does.
Well, you go into Parliament, whether it's the House of Lords or the House of Commons, particularly the House of Commons, promising to support a particular party. Now, you won't be able to do that with a good conscience every single time, and sometimes your conscience tells you you're not going to support the government or your party. And it's the whip's job to impose discipline. And they are like the regimental sergeant majors, who are there to make sure that they get all the troops in line and through the lobbies. And if you don't, and if you kick up trouble, they can be pretty ferocious, really ferocious. In fact, one of the great joys of hanging around one of the bars in the Palace of Westminster is listening to the old lags recount their stories of how whips have treated them. And they're absolutely necessary, because parties do need discipline. It's a bit like... Politics is a bit like playing football. You know, we are all spectators of the game, but once you get onto the pitch to actually have to play the game yourself, it's very different. And no matter how brilliant you are, it's a team game, and you have to pass the ball occasionally, and you have to play to team orders. Now, obviously not all the time, because in football and politics they are not absolutely regimented, but they are similar in the sense that you've got to get on with the team. And those who are successful at the end of the day do get on with their team. Not all the time. I mean, Winston Churchill was quite often a rebel. But those who are determined to simply be rebels rarely flourish.
And of course, in the Commons, it's much easier for the whips in many ways, because they've got 650 people, most of whom want to be ministers. So you've got something to blackmail them with. Whereas in the House of Lords, I imagine it's rather different, because if a whip comes up to you, Michael, and says, no, you really do need to vote this way, they've got no leverage over you, have they?
They're so much nicer and pleasanter. I mean, I say that whips in both houses, you know, if they have a disagreement with you, they will rip off a sensitive part of your anatomy and throw it away. But the difference is that in the Lords, once they've had the row, they will then pick you up and help you find them.
Well, that's a good way of putting it.
Go ahead.
Now, the character of Francis Urquhart. Now, many people listening will have read the House of... In fact, there was a trilogy, wasn't there? House of Cards, To Play the King, and The Final Cut. And it was then made into TV drama, which is still being shown on channels here. In fact, I was in America once. I remember seeing it on the TV there. The character of Francis Urquhart... I felt that, and it's unusual for this, I felt that the TV dramatisation absolutely got the character right. That Ian Richardson, who played Francis Urquhart, I mean, he clearly had read the book. Were you happy with how it was portrayed?
I was very happy with House of Cards. I thought it was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. But then, of course, nothing lasts forever. And by the third episode, which was Final Cut, I had a big falling out with the BBC because they got it entirely wrong and they paid no attention to the book, so I took my name off it. But that wasn't Ian's fault, and he played it stupendously. He was such a great actor, and it's such a pity that he's died 2 years ago. But even even without saying a word, he could look at the camera and everything would come alive. I mean, you would sense what was going on inside him. And there are very few actors who have that ability. And it was, I went to his memorial service, which was very touching. It was in Covent Garden, where the actors all seem to have their memorial services. And you may remember at the very opening of House of Cards, Francis Urquhart, Ian, is looking at a framed photograph of Margaret Thatcher. And he turns it face down and he says, "Nothing lasts forever." So we went to this memorial service, and it was brilliant. It had all of the great names of the British theatre in. It was hilarious, I mean, because they were hamming it up and everybody was having a good time in his memory. And I thought that we'd finished, and then just as we were preparing to leave, the speakers in the church crackled. And there was Ian saying, "Nothing lasts forever."
Really?
And as we walked out to the theme music of House of Cards. And I have to say, I blubbed all the way to the outside.
See, I'm welling up now.
Yeah. It was really lovely. The theatrical profession is... it's wonderful when they come together to do something like that. It really is.
But a great moment for you as well. I mean...
Well, frankly, when Ian got hold of it, I mean, he took it and raised it to a different level, and I was something of a spectator, but my goodness me, was I a grateful one.
Well, if you have a question for Michael Dobbs about the House of Cards trilogy, the Churchill trilogy, or indeed his current projects featuring Harry Jones, his new book is called Old Enemies. It's published this week by Simon & Schuster, $12.99. 0845 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text your question into 84850. You can email ian@lbc.co.uk, or you can tweet to me at lbc973. The time now is 9:15. Time for travel with Alan Cowie.
Thank you, Ian. Good evening. The police have closed /podcasts.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club, and with me this hour is Michael Dobbs. He's the author of Old Enemies. I keep calling him Michael Dobbs. I really should call him my Lord, or Lord Dobbs. Michael, how did you find out that you were going to be made a peer? How does it work?
Well, I can only tell you how it worked for me. I got a phone call from the Prime Minister.
It's just so I know when it happens to me, obviously.
Oh, absolutely.
Just so I can prepare myself.
Well, I'm not sure it would happen to you quite like this, because I got a phone call from the Prime Minister and said, we want you to come and help us in the House of Lords. And I said, "Ooh, that's interesting. Thank you very much." And I then called my wife to tell her. And she was, like all good housewives, we live in a very normal family with 4 kids still in education. And she was on her hands and knees with the marigold gloves on, scrubbing the downstairs loo. And so I said, he's asked me to join the House of Lords. And then there was this long silence. And then she said, "Does that mean I can give up the cleaning job?"
Yeah, well, she can be called Lady, can't she? So that there are consolations.
Yes, but it doesn't help having a young family. I mean, we sat around the table and the kids started coming up with potential names, because it's quite confusing. But as a lord, I'm a baron. And they suggested that I call myself Baron Wasteland. Another suggestion was Baron Loins, which I thought was particularly unkind. And I waited, the very next day, I waited in bed to have my breakfast brought up for me on a silver tray. And do you know what happened? Absolutely nothing. And I had to go and get my breakfast for myself as usual.
We wouldn't want it to go to your head.
I don't think there's going to be much chance of that, I'm afraid.
Right, let's talk a bit about your writing. What made you start writing? When you started House of Cards, had you always wanted to be a writer, or was it something you just thought, well, I'm going to try my hand at this, see if I'm any good?
No, it was... I'd never wanted to be a writer, but I've always loved books. If you want to keep me quiet as a kid, just give me a book and I'd be 2 days sat in the corner just devouring it. And it was actually after that election campaign which we were talking about before, and I took my then wife away on holiday for the first time in about 2.5 years. And I was being very pompous about a book that I was reading. And I obviously got too pompous about it, because she said words to the effect of, "Stop being so pompous. If you think you can do any better, for goodness sake, go and do it. But I haven't come away on holiday for the first time in 2.5 years to listen to you go on and on and on about this wretched book." And very seriously, and I can't really explain it, but I did mention that alcohol came into all great moments of my life. I went down that afternoon to the pool with a pad and a pen and a bottle of wine, and said to myself, I wonder whether I can write a book. And 24 hours later, I had and I think it was about 3 bottles later, I had a plot, an outline of a plot, which I thought, this actually sounds a bit of fun. Maybe I'll try and do the joined-up bits in between, and that's the book that became House of Cards. And I honestly didn't write it with the expectation of getting it published, or it's certainly not of changing my life, although it did. It was really much more of, it's like climbing Ben Nevis. You get to the top, and you look from the summit, and it's very important to you to have done it. It means nothing to anybody else, but for you, it's a little marker. And that's what it was going to be for me.
And you've written 17 novels now. Do you approach them all in the same way? Do you have the same way of mapping out a plot and then filling in the blanks? Or, I mean, Anne Widdecombe, when I've talked to her about this, she says, well, I do map out a plot, but there's always a character that takes me by surprise. Does that happen to you?
It's changed over the years. I used to be very much plot-driven, and I'm now increasingly... the plots still have to be, from my point of view, still absolute crackers. But more and more the characters, the individuals, take control of those plots and bring those plots to life. And so I'm writing much more now about characters and relationships and things like that within the thrillers, because at the end of the day, one thing a thriller must have is plenty of thrills, and it must have a great pace to it and keep everybody in suspense until the very last moment. So that, I hope, I've still maintained, or perhaps even got better at. But the characters, and my latest character, Harry Jones, is a man that I just love exploring, which is why I'm going on and on writing about him.
We'll come on to him in a second, but I think it's very interesting that you seem to write your books in blocks. So you had the House of Cards trilogy, you've had the Winston's War, that was a trilogy as well.
Well, four, yes. What do they call 4? I've never...
a quadrology.
Probably,
well,
yes.
I don't know. Probably. Anyway, it sounds feasible, doesn't it?
Yes.
And then this is the 4th Harry Jones book. How do you know when you've reached the end?
Well, with Francis Urquhart, when I'd killed him off for the second time, actually. I'd actually killed him off in House of Cards in the first book, but I brought him back to life again, a bit like Lazarus. With Winston Churchill, the 4th book took place at the end of World War II, so it seemed to be a natural pause, at least. I'd be very happy to go back and write more about Winston Churchill, because he's such a fascinating character. But that was a pause, and I went on to other things. With Harry could go on and on and on. I suppose it comes a point where you must never get bored with writing about your character, but I haven't yet. And in fact, the more I write about him, the more I get to know him, so to speak, the more interested I'm getting in him. And I think, he can come alive in many different ways.
What's the most difficult thing about being a writer, and particularly a novelist?
It's... there is a lot of pressure, the worst day of the year for me is knowing that tomorrow I've got to start another book, because it's very hard work, physically, emotionally. It's a bit like starting a marathon, and there's going to be a lot of pain involved, but once you've finished it, of course, you feel brilliant, and you're very glad that you put all that effort into it. But it's not an easy process. It's not something which is you can squeeze into the margins of your life, not if you're going to do it properly. You really have to devote a great chunk of your life into making this whole thing come alive. The research is wonderful. The bringing about of the concept, the plot, is great fun, but then you've actually got to do the really hard work. And it takes me hours and hours and hours of every day for months to put it down. The
research, I think, is really interesting here, because, this latest book is, part of it set in Trieste. Do you go to Trieste?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, and that was wonderful. You can't write about these things from a distance, I don't think. But if you do go there, you get so much more impetus. Trieste... Why did I choose Trieste? Partly because I didn't know enough about it, and I wanted to know more. And I wanted a plot that was set sort of somewhere in that sort of area. Venice is a bit of a cliche. How many people have written about Venice? But I don't know many people who've ever written about Trieste or know anything about it. And it's a brilliant place. It's bizarre. It's like an old 19th century Austrian city dumped on the side of the Adriatic. And I mean, the last century it was ruled by 6 or 7 different governments, and it's such a great place for plots and undercurrents. And as soon as you get there, you feel that it has an atmosphere which is different from any other place that I've ever been, at least.
Got a couple of questions here from listeners. Sally says, can you ask Michael if the character Tim Stamper was based on anyone in particular? Now, better explain you can explain exactly who Tim Stamper was. He was effectively Francis Urquhart's deputy in House of Cards, wasn't he?
He was indeed Francis' deputy in the House of Cards, and all good, great whips have deputies. And I was actually just chatting about a couple of great deputies from the 1970s this evening, who sadly sort of drank themselves to death. A lot of them came from military backgrounds, came out of the war, and so they knew about discipline, they knew about doing the right thing, and they were pretty selfless, but also pretty ruthless. And they were ideal people for whips or for deputy whips, being in the whip's office. And Tim Stamper came right out of that sort of military background, remorseless, unremitting, no excuses, but with a wry sense of humour.
Now, David says, did you ever argue with Maggie? If so, what about? Well, you've given a clear hint that, you actually said you did.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, actually, it's more difficult to argue with her. You were there while she argued with you. So,
but she actually liked a good argument, didn't she?
Oh, she did. Well, she did in the early years, certainly. And that's what made her so effective, because she listened to arguments early on. And again, I'm being super critical here, but I'm trying to put things in a broader context, because every single Prime Minister seems to have this real problem that they never know when to go. The last Prime Minister who actually went out in their own time was Harold Wilson. And I guess a lot of listeners won't even have been born when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. He resigned, and everybody said, why has he resigned? There must be a reason. And then there were all sorts of conspiracy theories. Before him, the previous Prime Minister to resign in his own time without being pushed, stabbed, hacked, or dragged out of Downing Street was Stanley Baldwin way back in 1937. So, I mean, there is something about the prime ministerial job that, it all tends to go sour for them in the end. But the question was, what did I argue with her about? Mostly about how the election campaign of 1987 should be run. That was a big row, which resulted
that was,
from
of course, the election campaign
being banned from checkers and
Wobbly Thursday. I seem to remember. I remember that campaign well. Well, if you have a question you'd like to put to Michael, the number to call is 0845 6060 973, and you can text the question to 84850. I'm with Michael Dobbs, the author of Old Enemies.
LBC 97.3.
And coming up at 10 is Clive Bull, who's here to tell us what's on his show. Hi, Clive.
Hi there. Yes, I'll be here at 10. What are we going to talk about tonight? Well, I thought we'd have a look at the mayoralty race. As I know it's a long way to go, but interesting poll out today showing that they're pretty much neck and neck, Ken and Boris. So I'd like to test the water and just get some feeling about how Boris is doing and whether people really would like Ken back. I mean, we often get a lot of criticism of Ken. Certainly have done over the years, but it would appear that he seems just about as popular as Boris. So does that mean we don't really want either of them, or is Boris kind of less impressive than he was? What's happened?
Of course, Boris is trying to paint Ken as a sort of 90s nostalgia act.
Well, I thought we would find out. Just put a bit of facts onto the figures there. We're also going to talk about Twitter, one of your favourite subjects.
Indeed.
We've got this, the first ever Chief Constable tweeting now.
God save us. Whatever next? I mean, have they not got anything to do all day? I mean, I clearly haven't, but I mean, you do expect a Chief Constable. It won't be them, will it?
You do wonder with a lot of these people whether they're actually doing their own tweets. You've probably got a head of tweeting somewhere that sends out your messages.
I am my own head of tweeting, and I'm responsible for everything that appears on my Twitter.
So I thought we'd find out whether anyone's interested in following the tweets of a Chief Constable. And should you have a television in your bedroom?
I do.
Well, there's a no over there and a yes
Michael
there.
Michael is shaking his head. No, definitely.
Well,
Why not?
There we are. Then we've clearly got a heated debate on on for us. Then 50% yes, 50% no. Obviously, with children as well, it's even more of an issue.
Yeah, if I had children, I don't think I would let.
No. But it's all right for grown-ups then.
Of course it is, absolutely right.
I don't like them personally. I don't like the idea of a TV in the bedroom. But,
I don't actually hardly ever switch it on, funnily enough.
No, I think
there are better things to do.
Aren't there?
Including sleep.
Yes, mainly sleep, yes. OK, all coming up at 10, thank you.
I thought we were going to go off on a tangent there, but we're looking forward to it, Clive. Now, before then, we're continuing with the LBC Book Club. I'm with Michael Dobbs, the author of Old Enemies. We've been talking about the House of Cards. I want to get on to his new book, Old Enemies, in just a second, but I really enjoyed the quadrology about Churchill, which, for those of you who haven't read them, what the first one was...
It was Winston's War, followed by Never Surrender, followed by Churchill's Hour, followed by Churchill's Triumph, which basically took him over most of the years of the war.
And you basically invented a new kind of literary genre, didn't you? Because it was based on facts, but it was fiction. And using real people, and it kind of worked. I was gripped by it, I have to say. And I must admit, when I picked up the first one, I thought, I'm not going to like this, because I'd liked all your other books, and I thought, this is the one I'm not going to like, because I can't quite see how it'll work. But it was fascinating. The only thing that I found difficult was I couldn't work out which bits were factual and which bits weren't. But of course, the joy of that is that for people who weren't really interested in history, having read that book, they will have hopefully then gone and read the history of the era.
But they should still ask themselves the same question, even when they finish reading a history book. Was that really how it was? And because it's a history book doesn't mean to say that it was right. And you see what novels can do is actually make the characters come to life, because Winston Churchill was such a rich character, yet we treat him in a history book almost as a cardboard cutout, as if he doesn't have a private life, as he doesn't have a personal life, he doesn't have any personal problems that he brings with him. But anybody who knows Winston Churchill knows that he was hounded by personal problems and internal debates and discussions and worries all of his life. He was a desperately unhappy child, and he ended up being quite a difficult old man too. And you can't get the richness and the wonder of his story unless you know what he was really like. And that's what novels can do, which formal history books have great difficulty in.
Well, I can highly recommend it. Start with Winston's War. It's the first in the series. And if you're interested in the Second World War, if you're interested in Churchill, you're going to love it, I promise you. Quick question here from Simon in Hackney. What does Michael think about Meryl Streep playing Margaret Thatcher?
Well, I was having a conversation about that earlier today with somebody saying, oh, is it disgraceful, Margaret Thatcher being played by Meryl Streep and they'll tear it up pieces. I said, well, hang on, let's just wait and see before we sort of condemn it. Margaret Thatcher has been played by at least 20 different actresses over the course of the recent years, which I think is a mark of just how extraordinary a character Margaret Thatcher is. And Meryl Streep is a brilliant actress, and whatever sort of interpretation she gives it, she's going to do it exceptionally well, I suspect. So I'm actually looking forward to it. Whether I will agree with it or not is another matter, and it won't be entirely accurate, because no actress can ever, in one role, sort of sum up we've already this evening been talking about different sides of Margaret Thatcher. So I just think it's a huge compliment. I mean, if somebody were to make 20-odd different representations of you or me, I think we'd be quite pleased and chuffed about it. Really.
Who would you like to play you? I think Nigel Havers.
I think he'd have to put on a few pounds, wouldn't he?
Barbara in Perivale says, Ian, House of Cards, absolutely brilliant, and we've just bought the DVD box set to enjoy again. There's such a dearth of good political drama on TV now, and Francis Urquhart was such a superb character. That's quite a good point, because it's not just a dearth of political drama on TV. Political fiction has more or less disappeared as a genre, because publishers think that it just doesn't sell. I think it's a huge shame.
And I think it's a mistake. It's always... television requires a bit of gumption at times from commissioning editors to take a risk. They think that politics is a risk. But if you think back over the course of, the last 20-odd years, you've had some brilliant TV. You've had House of Cards. Now, I can say House of Cards was brilliant because it was the BBC who did the dramatisation, not me. You've had things like A Very British Coup. Yeah. Beautiful to watch. Edge of Darkness. Your State of Play, which was one which was fairly recent, which was pretty political, which is excellent. So there've been many more hits. Oh, yeah, and Yes Minister, of course, where we all sat back and for years and years and years laughed our socks off. So I think it's sad that the commissioning editors haven't sort of sought out more political fiction, political drama, because the great thing about Westminster and politics is it's so full of passion and drama and characters and colour.
I mean, my publishing company has been debating whether to actually start a political fiction imprint because no one else is doing it, but we haven't quite decided whether to do it yet or not.
There is a real problem with that, though, Ian, in the sense that to get political fiction right, you've got to know what you're talking about, which means you've got to be on the inside. And if you're on the inside, it's terribly difficult to find the real time to write good books, which is why when MPs try their hand at political fiction, it's a bit slapdash because it tends to be tucked away in the margins of their life rather than being a central part of their life.
Right, let's move on to, finally, after 40 minutes, you might say, let's move on to your current book, Old Enemies. Now, it's the fourth in a series of books about a character, Harry Jones. How did you come to create the character, Harry Jones?
I wanted a politician, not... I mean, he doesn't visit the House of Commons at all in this particular book. So he's a politician only as an excuse to get him involved in all sorts of adventures. Politicians have the whole world coming to their door, and they travel a lot and get involved in many different places. In this particular book, we talked earlier about how relationships and characters are becoming much more important to me. He bumps into one of the old great loves of his life that he tore himself apart over many years before, so 20 years before. And so it's a bit of a story of a lost relationship and, what if? I mean, I suppose many of us have occasional thoughts about what if that relationship had worked out? What if I'd done something different? Where would my life be now? And we all have some regrets, and Harry's a man who's filled with regrets. Got nothing really to do with him as a politician. And then his former lover's young son gets kidnapped because she is now married to a wealthy media man, and he is kidnapped in Europe, ends up in Trieste, the city that we were talking about earlier, and the official system can't deal with it. So in desperation, she calls up her old lover to see whether he can help her, because he has a military background. He's got quite an adventurous background himself. But although there's loads and loads of action as he tries to get to grips with this kidnapping, it's also about his relationship and his current life and its emptiness, and it's also about parental love for children, which will, it will stop at nothing. And all the rules go out of the window. If your kid is kidnapped, it doesn't matter what the law says, it doesn't matter what anybody says, you will try to get them back no matter what the cost.
How has the character developed over the series?
It's developed a great deal because he started off in a book called The Lord's Day, which was really a plot to kidnap the House of Lords. I don't know why they've let me in there. Why they've dared let me in there after the state opening of Parliament, which all takes place in the palace, in one room, in the House of Lords, the chamber of the House of Lords. And you've got everybody there, the royal family, the lords, the judges, the ambassadors, all the leading figures in government. And you lock the doors and hold them hostage. I thought it was a brilliant idea. And he started this, it was a plot I dreamed up about 15 years ago, and I had the chance to do it. And Harry Jones was the start of that. He was the one who played the key role in that. And I enjoyed that so much that I wanted to carry on with him. So he's now been in various different parts of the world. The last book he was in Central Asia, called The Reluctant Hero. This book he's in Trieste. So it gives me great fun to take him around the world, meeting up with his past life, which is troubled. I mean, he's not the cliche working class character. He's actually...
Well, we should give him his full title: The Right Honourable Henry Marmaduke Maltravers Jones, MP, PC, GC, MC, DSO, GSM, MLit, MA, and it says much, much more.
Absolutely. Born into a very wealthy family, where yet his father cut him off at the age of 16. Said, go and, make your own life now. So he went to Cambridge because he's a great guy, but he ended up working at McDonald's to get himself through Cambridge. He's a man who says it doesn't matter what happens, I'm going to find some way through it. He then got into the army.
So it's true. What do you say to a Cambridge graduate with a job? Big Mac and large fries, please.
Well, I hadn't heard that one, but it is. And he ends up doing some pretty dirty things in Northern Ireland too, as a soldier during those dirty war days in Northern Ireland. And that's actually relevant to this book too, because one of his protagonists is the grandfather of the kidnapped boy, who is Irish and fought on the other side in that horrid war in Northern Ireland.
Well, the time now is 10:15. You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and Michael Dobbs. If you have a question for Michael, 0845 6060 973, or you can text it to 84850 or email ian@lbc.co.uk. Well, as I say, it is 10:15. And here's Alan Cowie with the travel.
Thank you, Ian. Good evening. The A202 Peckham High...
And you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and my guest this hour is Michael Dobbs, the author of Old Enemies, just published by Simon & Schuster, $19.99 if you like me and you like hardbacks on your shelves, or $12.99 in paperback, published simultaneously. Michael, we were talking about the character of Harry Jones. This is the fourth book in the series. And when you were talking to me about the character, it was almost as if he was a personal friend. And I suppose if you've written 4 books about someone, well, you clearly know more about them than anybody else. But does it feel like that? And when you finish writing a series like this, is it almost as if you've lost a friend?
Well, he does become a friend, I see him as a real individual, and I got to try and think of what his musical tastes are, what his tastes in food are. I mean, he's a very wealthy man, got a lot of money, so I try to follow through his life in every aspect. So I really do feel that I know him and I admire him and respect him, and I pity him, because there are lots of dark and difficult sides to his life, and I'm glad that my life isn't as complicated as his. And I don't feel sad when I finish the book, because at the moment I know that there are going to be more adventures from Harry, and I'm just about to start writing the next book, which will also be about Harry Jones. He's to me, I think he's got much more character and flavour and many more longer legs than even Francis Urquhart.
Do you look at the sales figures for each book and think, well, I mean, I suppose if the graph's on the way down, you think, well, maybe I better stop that one and start something new. Does that play a part in your decision, or you just think, well, I've gone as far as I can with this character?
In all honesty, I haven't looked at sales figures for more than 10 years.
Really?
Because they don't really tell you what you want. They're never what you want them to be anyway. They never tell you what you want to know, and it's a very good way of becoming deeply neurotic.
So I'm looking at Amazon every day to see what position my book is on Amazon.
No, I've got a very good publisher in Simon & Schuster. I trust them. They have a long-term strategy, so I know they're not just publishing this book.
Yeah.
They've got plans for the future books too. And I think this is probably one of the most fruitful publishing relationships that I've ever had. And if it's a fruitful relationship, you've got to trust in the fact that eventually it will also be the most profitable too.
What's it like to change a publisher? Because you've gone from HarperCollins to Headline to Simon & Schuster, and it can be quite traumatic for an author to change a publisher.
It's horrible. Absolutely horrible. I mean, I was with HarperCollins for 12, 13, 14 years. And you don't say goodbye to people that you've known that long without, some real regret. But there comes a time when you've got to say that to yourself, this isn't quite doing what I want it to do. And, I haven't got, 3 or 4 years for them to turn themselves round to do what I want them to do. So you go elsewhere. You hope you're going to fall into favourable hands. I now have fallen into great hands with Simon & Schuster, and and I feel as if, fun enough, I feel, although I've been writing for 20 years, I feel as if the best is yet to come.
Well, I hope you're right, because if it is, it's going to be fantastic after what you've achieved so far. Of course, the real money in books isn't in books at all, is it? It's in Hollywood. And you've got a couple of little projects on the go
Well, I've got
in
several.
Hollywood.
Well, on the go, you sell your soul to Hollywood, don't you? Yeah, I mean, Hollywood, I've got three books at the moment that are optioned by Hollywood, and two of them are being very actively worked on. Sometimes Hollywood just options a book and then you never hear anything.
What does that mean? If somebody options a book, what happens?
They pay you money for the right to have exclusive access to that book while they think about whether they want to develop it into a film. So usually it lasts for 2 years, and during those 2 years you cannot sell it on to anybody else. If the Hollywood company then decides that it does want to develop it, it has a right to pay you and to get those rights from you. And at the moment, I've got two Hollywood companies who are working away very fast and furious at House of Cards, to turn House of Cards into an American TV series, and also to turn Harry Jones into what they call a franchise character. Now, it's wonderful because 9 times out of 10 in Hollywood, or 99 times out of 100, a British character in a Hollywood film is going to be a villain. I think there are perhaps the biggest obvious exception to that is James Bond. But we know James Bond is a bit long in the tooth now, and they want to find another British character like that who they can carry on and on and on, but turning into sort of modern adventure stories. And Harry Jones is the chap that Columbia have chosen to try, and they're working very hard on it. So I'm not losing sleep over it, because it would change my life. As you say, there is real...
Yeah.
There's real money in it.
Then your wife can give up the cleaning job.
Then the wife can give up the cleaning job, and we could probably not have to worry too much about mortgage payments and things like that. But that's nothing to do with me. As an author, I don't give it a moment's thought. That will happen if it happens. All I can do is to carry on producing what I regard as being first-class adventure stories. And the more I do that, the more chance I've got of something happening.
What do you read?
Sadly, not enough, because while I produce a book a year, and that requires so much that I haven't, I've got a whole bookcase of books that I want to read in retirement, which are all great classics that I have. But what do I read? What am I reading right now? I've just finished a Tom Rob Smith book, Child 44. Brilliant. He's a very young new writer. The book set in Stalinist Russia. I've recently read Huckleberry Finn, because I'd never read that before. I read Christmas Carol over Christmas because I'd never read that and laughed all the way through it. Dickens isn't my favourite author, but that one I particularly enjoyed. And I think that probably suggests to you that nowadays my reading is the reading that I do for pleasure rather than for my own purposes, research for my own book. It's all over the place. I just love grabbing books here, there and everywhere and reading things that I never realised that I was going to be interested in. And 9 times out of 10, I find that I really have enjoyed it.
Let's have a couple of words on the state of politics at the moment. Do you think we're in a rather unhealthy state at the moment, where people look down their noses at politicians so much that it's almost impossible for politics to actually get back on an even keel?
We've always looked down our noses at politicians. You go back to those Hogarth prints, which we'll all remember, and the politicians there were being roundly abused by Hogarth. So that's not new. But we have actually plumbed some new depths recently. I think and it will take time to recover. I mean, when I was knocking on doors during the election campaign, the expenses scandal came up almost everywhere, all the time. I actually happen to think that was overdone, that we were being unfair to a lot of good people, as well as to the bad ones. I mean, there were a few rotten eggs there that really deserved what they are getting, so to speak. But a lot of others weren't the villains that they were portrayed. But, there's no point in sitting here saying, oh, well, it's all unfair. We have to move on. And what I hope that the next few years in politics will enable us to do is to remember that whether we like it or not, politics is and politicians are very important to our lives, and hopefully get a bit of patience back into the system so that we can give them the time to do the job that they've got to do.
And in about 30, 40 seconds, what do you hope to achieve by being a member of the House of Lords?
I hope, first and foremost, to have a brilliant time, because I think it may be the most brilliant job in the whole world. But also, with a voice, it's only a small voice, it's only one voice, but to do one or two things that I think are hugely important to help the system along. One of those will be to help this country recover from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's done so much damage to us here. And once the war is over, once the soldiers come back, we will have to work very hard to secure the peace, not over there, but here, and to restore a lot of the damage that's been done. And I'd love to be able to play a bit of a role in that.
Well, we look forward to watching you. Michael Dobbs, thank you very much for joining us on the LBC Book Club tonight. Michael's book is called Old Enemies. It's published by Simon & Schuster, $19.99 in hardback, $12.99 in paperback, available at all good and bad bookshops right now. Now, over the next few weeks on the LBC Book Club, you'll be able to hear from Peter Mandelson. Stephanie Powers is going to join me. Remember her from Heart to Heart? And when they met, it was murder. And Sarah Brown will be here too. Next week, it's Bill Brown, author of I'll Tell Your Mother. Coming up next, Clive Ball. This is LBC 97.3.
At Amazing Tiles, we know that the most important